Okay, Heather, how long have you lived in Fitzroy?
Well, I moved into North Fitzroy on the 6th of November 1973, which was Cup Day, I remember.
And have you lived in the same house all that time?
Yes, all that time.
Yeah. And do you think North Fitzroy is a lot different to Southern Fitzroy?
Yes, I think it probably is actually. It's always been a bit more gentrified, I understand, and certainly parts of it, where I live in Michael Street, is a much wider street than the streets in Fitzroy, South Fitzroy, I suppose we'd call it. And this, and it's also been, I think it got much less run down in the 1890s and so on than South Fitzroy did, and it never developed with the same degree of, it never, I wouldn't say, well, I was going to say slumminess, and certainly, I suppose, even objectively, some parts of South Fitzroy did become real slums. All of Fitzroy was perceived to be a slum for considerable periods of the early part of the 20th century anyway. But I don't think North Fitzroy ever had quite the same reputation as South Fitzroy. So it's been different in that way, I think. And of course, I mean, I moved in just at the beginning of the era when it was becoming a trendy suburb. That was the word we used in those days, where I was seen, I suppose I was a sort of trendy, although I didn't move here for that reason. I moved because I'd started teaching at Deer Park, and I was finishing an MA at Monash, and I needed to live somewhere that was about halfway between the two that didn't involve driving through the city. So, and it was also a question of where I could afford to live, and North Fitzroy at that stage was, relatively speaking, was cheaper than North Carlton, probably still is actually, and certainly cheaper than North Melbourne, and they were two of the most, and they were two of the most obvious other places to look at, and Richmond hadn't become or Collingwood hadn't become sort of trendy places by then. So I guess for all those reasons.
Do you remember the freeway debate in the 70s?
Yes, I do. I remember I didn't actually take part in the blockade, but I do remember the blockade across the freeway with. I remember the piles of furniture at the corner of Wellington Street and maybe even of Gold Street. I can't quite remember actually. I think it was either Wellington or Gold Street, perhaps both. And probably, actually, when I think about it, it's probably Gold Street, because that later became blocked off by the median strip, and you can't drive continuously across that stretch now.
Do you think that the road splits the suburb in two?
Yes, I think it does. I think it probably, in a way, it always did, because it was it's a very big, wide expanse.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, it was actually, the original name of it was Riley Street, and that was the reason the median strip is so huge, is that there's actually a vast sewer that runs down the middle, and before that there was a famous Riley Street drain into which dead cows and cows and drunks and others fell, and the sewage ran, I think, along it, and this was before the area was sewered, and it was a very smelly, dirty place, and so I guess it was probably after the area was sewered that the street was, that drain was filled in, and the name was changed, and I assume it was changed to in honour of she would have been, I suppose, the wife of the Prince of Wales at the time, Alexandra. That's presumably why it's named that.
And what period are we talking about?
Well, that would have been, Melbourne, as I understand, I think our area was sewered in about the 1870s, but I'm not absolutely sure. I don't know about that, because late in the 1970s, maybe early 1980s, they relined all the water pipes and sewers and things in our area, and I remember one of the people I think one of the mains that had been relined burst, and I had to ring up what was then the Board of Works and say, look, we haven't got any water. And he said, oh, we're having terrible troubles because we're relining all these pipes, and they were laid about 100 years ago, so that would have been 1870s or early 1880s, and I guess, well, I mean, the Prince of Wales who later became, Edward VII, his wife was Alexandra, so I assume that's why, yeah, I think yes, so I assume it was named after her.
So do you think because Fitzroy is such an old suburb that it has a specific identity? Or?
Well, yes, I suppose it does. And it certainly isn't just as a slummy place, but I mean, it is as I understand it, the oldest suburb of Melbourne. And I think in Georgiana's journal, which was the journal of Georgiana McRae, after her, or after his family, McRae down on the Mornington Peninsula is named, they first settled somewhere around, I don't know if they actually settled in Fitzroy, but in her journal she mentions Fitzroy as being established as a little sort of suburb outside of the central Melbourne. So it's been around for a very long time, so in Australian terms.
Yeah.
And its character must have, it must have developed a different character along the way.
Yeah.
And I suppose, it obviously at times there've been parts of it that have been very wealthy, judging by the size of the houses.
Yeah.
And then of course, as older areas of cities often do, it became quite degraded, and especially I think, of course, a lot of Melbourne was hit very hard by the failure of the when the land boom bust in 1893.
Yeah.
And so so that the nature of the suburb changed a lot, and places that have been, owned by one family, people just sold out, or they decided to move out anyway, and the working class sort of moved in. Well, they'd been moving in, obviously these houses, like this one even, would have been built in, my guess is by the look of it,
1890s.
well, no, I would have said this is earlier than that. My house was built in 1887.
Okay.
And the type of decoration and so on, I would guess, is about the same. This kind of curved pediment with the decorations on the top is fairly typical in the 1880s. And I think, in fact, well, I'm not sure about this part of Melbourne, but certainly in some other parts of Melbourne, houses that had been built to house workers were left standing empty for part of the 1890s because the workers couldn't afford to buy them, and so they were built, by spec builders, as a bit like some of the housing estates now, in places like Fitzroy, and they just couldn't find anyone to live in them because they couldn't afford the prices. And I think lots of Fitzroy was, the big houses were divided up at that stage into rooming houses, and that's when you got a lot of people crowding into small spaces and so on. And I guess, too, that the big institutions like the hospitals and so on tended to be built in a circle fairly close round the centre of the city, and so even before agencies like the Brotherhood of St Lawrence set up in the 1930s, this would have been an area that would have had quite a lot of people coming to it for services, in that way.
Yeah. Have you seen, in your own lifetime, or the time that you've lived here, have you seen a change of the people that live in Fitzroy?
Oh yes, I think so. I mean, I was just thinking now at the end of that previous sentence that, of course, another big change, which actually occurred in the 60s before I moved in, was the demolition of a lot of the older houses and the building of these high-rise flats, particularly in this area.
Yeah.
And because they are, what's now called social housing, or some public housing, then whoever is the sort of, as it were, the latest group of low-income people to arrive in the area, they're accommodated in these houses. So there's been a big shift in ethnic groups and all that sort of thing too. And I guess, and I'm noticing now, um, and I don't think that's in a negative sense at all, but it's quite interesting that the, say, the wave of Vietnamese who were very prominent in this part of Fitzroy, say 15 years ago, they're now spread further, and so we've got, for example, in Queen's Parade, which is my local shopping centre, we've got a Vietnamese hot bread shop now that wasn't owned by Vietnamese people, and I think there are Vietnamese or Chinese people who are certainly, if not actually, they may not own the business, but they're certainly working as, it looks like it's a family group in one of the fish and chip shops and so on. And it's, yes, there are still pockets of earlier waves of post-war immigration, post-Second World War immigration, that some Italian and Greek groups, and some of their social clubs and buildings and so on are still in around North Fitzroy or Clifton Hill, and so people will still come back from Doncaster or Templestowe or Keilor or wherever they move to for meetings of these local groups, but they're probably much more middle-aged and older people now than would have been a while back, because it's probably still basically the same group of people who are coming back, you know, rather than a lot of young people following them into these clubs, is my guess. But that's just a guess, because I haven't been to any of the meetings.
So for a lot of people coming to Australia, Fitzroy would be their first view of Australia too.
Yes, I don't know whether that's still... Well, I suppose it is, because after all, the Learning Network, we've got asylum seekers from Afghanistan and Iraq and all sorts of places. Yes, well, if it's not their first, it probably isn't their first view of Australia. Their first view of Australia would be Ashmore Reef or somewhere and then a detention centre. But once they've actually been allowed to come and live in a reasonably normal community, this is probably, yes, their first view of Australia. And I mean, I'm so used to places like Smith Street and less Victoria Street, not because I have an objection to it, it's just a bit further away and I don't shop there very much, but Smith Street or Brunswick Street or wherever, that it doesn't strike me as strange that you see a huge variety of faces and ethnic groups and stuff in a smaller space. But in fact, it always strikes me as surprising when other people are surprised. And I think, gosh, are there some places where you don't see people like this? Yes, there's certainly been waves of people coming through. And in fact, I think Brunswick Street's a rather interesting example of a kind of an attempt, I won't say it, an attempt to recapture an area, and to some extent successful, but it's almost, Brunswick Street seems to me, to quite an extent, to be, as it were, the outsider's view of what some aspects of Fitzroy used to be like, because I have a feeling that a lot of people who go to Brunswick Street have really no connection with the suburb except coming to Brunswick Street, and I mean, they're perfectly entitled to, but they always claim it as their own possession in a way that ignores what it used to be like. And then again, it's all very well for me to say that, because in a sense I'm just doing the same thing, but a generation earlier, really. But when I first knew Brunswick Street, it still had wooden blocks in the tram lines, for example. In fact, it was one of the last streets that did, and it was fairly run down. But it's only probably about 5 or 6 years since one of my very elderly acquaintances was living in Brunswick Street, opposite the Fitzroy football ground, and and her sister, who has since died, was living with her, and her sister and her husband, when he'd been alive, they had run a newsagent just north of Alexandra Parade, and supplied the newspapers for all the, I don't know whether they as far over as where I live now, but certainly up Brunswick Street and all that, probably the area just west of Brunswick Street, and that was it's a very different sort of lifestyle from what Brunswick Street represents now to most of the rest of Melbourne.
Yeah. So is there anything that you see that might threaten the unique character or community fabric of Fitzroy? You know, any sort of things that may happen in the future or present trends? Or, you know, sort of like maybe inappropriate developments?
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably the first thing that springs to mind. Yes, inappropriate building developments,
Yeah.
because it's now an expensive place to live. There are always people who are wanting to make to profit from, you know, perhaps quite legitimately wanting to build houses and things to make a profit, and so because the infrastructure is fairly old, and obviously some of it is probably not worth endlessly renovating and repairing. It probably is better to pull it down in some cases. But yes, there's a tendency for, in terms of streetscapes and so on, to put up housing that's not necessarily very high quality, perhaps has a rather mass-produced look, is often out of scale with the buildings around it. I mean, thank goodness, I don't think anybody would allow the building of high-rise flats like the ones we now have anymore. And that was quite literally done by people driving around in cars saying, oh, here's a slum, you know, we'll pull it down, without ever checking to see what it was really like. But yes, I think that's a constant danger, and I suppose behind that lies a view of what place is about, and you know, what rights people have to do business and make money and so on. I suppose there are other things that might, which may be even in a way associated with that, but there's also, I guess, as anywhere where there's change, there are some changes that people resist, perhaps unfairly. For example, well, connected with a possible building is, for example, the house of the Gentle Bunyip up in Gold Street, or corner of Gold Street and Hodgkinson Street.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, that was where a developer wanted to put up, I think, I'm not sure how many stories the building was going to be, 3 or 4 stories high, and you know, quite a number of dwellings on a reasonably small site, and the house that was to be demolished was the last surviving farmhouse in the district, and you know, quite an architectural interest itself.
Yeah.
But the solution that's been found to that problem, which I think is splendid, and that is providing housing for people with psychiatric disabilities, but not people who are in danger to the surrounding district. You know, that's been resisted by some of the people who live fairly close to it. Only a small group, but they become extremely vociferous, apparently, and really very nasty about it. And so I don't think they've won, but they, you know, there's that kind of problem as well. That although I suppose it's the old "not in my backyard" principle, where big change and development and trendiness and all that sort of thing is really lovely, as long as it's not upsetting to ourselves, or it's not going to make any difference to us.
Yeah.
That may be a human characteristic anywhere in the world, I think.
Yeah. Okay. I think we'll wind it up. Okay. Thanks very much for your time,
You're welcome.
Heather.